For decades, the name Paul Eppinger circulated quietly through the prison yards and investigative files of Arizona law enforcement. Never loudly, never publicly, but always with a weight that suggested power. He wasn't the type of gang figure whose face appeared on television or whose fiery reputation was passed around by street-level soldiers. Instead, he operated in the darker, quieter corners of organized crime, building influence piece by piece until he eventually became what investigators now describe as the reigning leader of the Arizona Mexican Mafia. The organization itself, a notoriously violent and deeply entrenched prison gang, had been active since the late 1970s, growing from a prison-born brotherhood into a state-spanning syndicate controlling extortion, drug pipelines, murder-for-hire operations, and internal discipline for dozens of affiliated street gangs. But inside this world, ruled by coded messages, iron discipline, and rigid hierarchies, Eppinger's rise stood out because it was marked less by explosive displays of violence and more by strategy, patience, and an uncanny ability to move pieces without ever raising his voice. Long before his name drew national attention, Eppinger had already been a familiar face in state and federal custody. His criminal career began in the late 1980s, an era when Arizona's prison system was rapidly becoming ground zero for gang consolidation. Overcrowding, understaffing, and the growing power vacuum inside the yards gave rise to alliances forged for survival. A world where race, territory, and reputation became the currency of influence. Eppinger entered this landscape not as a foot soldier hungry for chaos, but as an observer, someone attuned to the subtleties of power. Those who knew him in the early years described him as deliberate, controlled, and calculating. He learned quickly that in a system where violence was expected, strategy was the true mark of leadership. In the early 2000s, federal prosecutors launched a series of sweeping indictments targeting the Arizona Mexican Mafia's leadership. Those cases, built using RICO statutes, painted a picture of an organization running a lethal empire from behind bars, coordinating murders, trafficking narcotics, and extorting street-level gangs for taxes on their illegal operations. Eppinger's name surfaced repeatedly in these investigations. Though he wasn't always the loudest figure in the room, he appeared in enough phone taps, coded messages, and witness statements that prosecutors viewed him not just as a member, but as one of the group's essential strategic minds. He was indicted in both Arizona and New Mexico on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to racketeering, a sign that his influence extended far beyond a single facility. Even behind bars, Eppinger carried a certain gravity that fellow inmates recognized. He wasn't a physically imposing figure in the traditional sense, nor did he boast the flamboyant bravado many gang leaders were known for. But he had something more valuable: connections, credibility, and an ability to command loyalty without theatrics. By the mid-2000s, multiple investigators, local, state, and federal, were already referring to him as a central organizer within the Mexican Mafia's Arizona faction. Despite that, his name rarely reached the public. Other figures drew more attention, often because they were louder, more reckless, or more visible. But in the world of gang politics, visibility could be a liability. Eppinger avoided that trap with uncanny precision. By the time he received his federal life sentence, it was already clear to anyone studying the organization that imprisonment alone would not diminish his reach. The Mexican Mafia, after all, was a gang that thrived in incarceration. The walls of federal and state prisons served not as barriers but as headquarters. Inmates communicated through coded letters, smuggled cell phones, attorney-client visits, and a network of loyal intermediaries. Orders flowed from the inside to the outside, rarely interrupted by distance or surveillance, and at the center of those orders, quietly, effectively, and consistently, sat Paul Eppinger. What made him so effective was his ability to maintain structure. Investigators often commented that he treated the Mexican Mafia not simply as a gang, but as an organization with roles, expectations, and consequences. He wasn't known for chaotic violence. He was known for controlled violence. When disciplinary actions needed to be carried out, whether that meant a beating, attacks, or a killing, members said he never reacted emotionally. Everything had purpose. Everything had strategy. In the violent ecosystem of prison politics, that type of leadership created stability, and stability created loyalty. Even as he aged into his 60s, Eppinger's influence did not wane. If anything, his reputation deepened as he became one of the gang's older, more seasoned figures. A man whose decades in confinement gave him a near-mythic status among younger Mexican Mafia members coming up through the ranks. He was a link to the organization's past and a strategist for its future. A man equally comfortable managing gang business from a control unit, as he was forging alliances with outside street crews. Yet throughout all of this, one question continued to shadow his name. How much violence had he either committed or orchestrated over the years? Prosecutors suspected his involvement in multiple homicides stretching back to the early 1990s, particularly as gang wars erupted across Phoenix, Tucson, and various prison yards. But suspicion is not evidence, and despite years of rumors, whispers, and confidential informants, definitive proof of his role in several murders remained elusive. His history seemed tightly sealed, protected by silence, loyalty, and time. That silence would not last forever. By the late 2010s, investigators began noticing shifts in the gang's communication patterns. Older members were aging out. Younger members were becoming more reckless. Disputes over money, power, and direction began to surface. Through it all, Eppinger continued to hold his position, using a blend of fear, respect, and political maneuvering that kept factions from fracturing. But even for a leader of his stature, the landscape was changing. Criminal enterprises were evolving, becoming more digital, more financially sophisticated, and more dependent on exploiting systemic vulnerabilities rather than relying solely on traditional violence. And when the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, shutting down thousands of businesses and overwhelming government systems, that new era of opportunity emerged. Across the country, gangs, fraud rings, and opportunistic offenders began exploiting weaknesses in unemployment benefit programs. The volume of claims flooded state agencies, verification collapsed under the pressure, and billions of dollars in emergency funds became easy targets for organized exploitation. In Arizona, investigators would later discover one of the figures benefiting from this chaos was none other than Paul Eppinger. The man who had built a lifetime of influence through silence, calculation, and old-school gang discipline was about to become the center of a fraud investigation that would unravel far more than anyone expected. What began as a financial crime probe, just another case in a long list of pandemic-era fraud schemes, would soon morph into something far darker. The past, buried for nearly 3 decades, was about to resurface. And the quiet kingpin of the Arizona Mexican Mafia was about to reveal secrets that no one could have predicted. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, the United States scrambled to create a financial safety net for millions suddenly out of work. Stimulus checks, business loans, and emergency unemployment programs were rolled out at unprecedented speed. But that speed came with enormous cracks. cracks large enough for entire criminal networks to slip through. What Arizona investigators would later uncover was that those cracks had become a pipeline of opportunity for dozens of offenders, including members and associates of the Arizona Mexican Mafia. At the heart of this scheme, though buried behind federal walls, was a familiar name: Paul Eppinger. The pandemic-era unemployment fraud operation that eventually exposed Eppinger began almost accidentally. Arizona's Department of Economic Security started noticing unusual claims, multiple applications tied to the same addresses, the same phone numbers, and the same IP patterns. Many of these claims listed applicants as unemployed residents needing relief. But investigators soon noticed something else. Many of these unemployed residents were actively incarcerated in state or federal prisons. That alone wasn't shocking. Fraud cases involving inmates had surfaced elsewhere in the country as well. But the scale in Arizona was different. It wasn't a handful of isolated offenders. It was a coordinated network, dozens deep. As state and federal agents began a joint investigation, the web quickly widened. They discovered that more than 30 individuals were involved: prison inmates, girlfriends, wives, cousins, and outside associates who helped file claims, route funds, and withdraw money. The scheme exploited the confusion of the moment. Overloaded staff, chaotic verification systems, and minimal cross-checking between correctional databases and unemployment offices. In many cases, payments were approved simply because there were too many claims and not enough personnel to review them manually. What investigators didn't expect, however, was the sophistication behind the operation. Many fraudulent claims showed signs of internal direction. Someone who understood how to structure paperwork, how to avoid triggering red flags, and how to distribute responsibilities so no single individual took on too much risk. That level of coordination suggested the involvement of an organized structure, not random opportunists. And whenever organized structure intersects with Arizona prisons, one name inevitably becomes part of the conversation: the Arizona Mexican Mafia. Even from within federal custody, Eppinger had long been known for maintaining communication lines with trusted intermediaries. Letters written in codes, messages delivered through family members during phone calls, instructions relayed through other inmates. None of this was new. But during the pandemic, communication systems in prisons became unusually strained. Lockdowns, restricted movement, and reduced programming made it more difficult for inmates to meet face-to-face. Many resorted to smuggled cell phones, contraband SIM cards, and clandestine call routes to maintain contact with the outside world. These adaptive communication methods allowed gang leaders like Eppinger to continue directing activities as if the world had never changed. Federal agents traced several of the fraudulent claims back to inmates believed to be under Eppinger's influence. But it wasn't enough to tie him directly to orchestrating the scheme. In cases involving high-ranking gang members, proving involvement is often the hardest part. Orders aren't written clearly. Phone calls are coded. Participants speak in vague terms, referring to crimes in metaphors or using layers of intermediaries. The Mexican Mafia, like many powerful prison gangs, uses an unspoken rule that dictates nothing is ever explicitly spelled out. Leadership gives direction, but subordinates create enough distance to shield those at the top. Still, the pieces kept adding up. Agents found banking transactions tied to girlfriends and relatives of known associates. They tracked debit cards issued under fraudulent claims to addresses connected to individuals who were part of the Mexican Mafia orbit. They uncovered patterns in how funds were withdrawn, small ATM withdrawals spread across different cities to avoid detection, purchases made in cash-heavy stores, prepaid cards stacked in wallets and purses. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't rushed. It was systematic. By the time the indictment dropped, the case had grown into one of Arizona's largest pandemic fraud investigations. 30 individuals were charged. Some were hit with federal counts, others with state offenses, depending on their roles. Buried within the indictment documentation, in the supporting affidavits and sealed attachments, were references to organizational control inside prison, references that law enforcement quietly understood pointed toward Eppinger. The idea that the leader of a violent prison gang would be involved in a financial fraud scheme might seem counterintuitive, but for investigators who understood gang evolution, it made perfect sense. Over the past 2 decades, high-level gang members across the country had been shifting toward white-collar crime, not because they were abandoning violence, but because fraud was safer, harder to trace, and more profitable. You can run fraud operations from a prison cell without ever having to order a stabbing or a hit. It was the modernization of organized crime, and Eppinger was adapting right along with it. As agents closed in, they began interviewing known associates. Most denied involvement. Some refused to speak. But as the investigation deepened, pressure mounted. Facing heavy fraud charges and the possibility of significant prison time, several individuals began cooperating, offering partial details about how the scheme was structured. Their statements didn't immediately point directly to Eppinger, but they described a hierarchy consistent with Mexican Mafia operations. Then came the moment investigators didn't predict. During one of the interviews, originally intended to gather more information on the fraud ring, Eppinger began to talk. Not about unemployment scams, not about money, not about fraudulent claims or organized fraud networks. He began talking about murder. Detectives were stunned. They had expected denials, dismissals, or evasions. Instead, Eppinger opened a door that had been closed for more than 30 years. He started describing killings, gang-related, ordered, carried out. Murders that had remained unsolved since the early 1990s. Some were cases law enforcement had nearly given up on. Others were cases so cold that younger detectives had only heard about them in passing from retired officers. And as he talked, the connection between the fraud investigation and the violent past of the Arizona Mexican Mafia became clearer. This wasn't a confession born from remorse. It was strategic. Why did he confess? That question would become one of the biggest mysteries of the entire case. Some investigators believed Eppinger offered the confessions as a bargaining chip, hoping to secure better conditions, protection, or transfers. Others thought it was a long-delayed purge, an aging gang leader seeking to unburden himself. But a smaller group of analysts proposed a more calculated theory, that by confessing to old murders, Eppinger might have been eliminating loose ends, closing chapters that could cause friction within the organization or threaten current leaders. In the world of gangs, confessions are rarely simple. They are moves on a chessboard. Whatever his reasoning, one thing was clear. The fraud investigation had unexpectedly cracked open a violent past. 5 murders, 5 separate cold cases, were suddenly back on the table. And the quiet, strategic kingpin of the Arizona Mexican Mafia was revealing the details himself. The fraud ring had exposed more than a financial crime. It had exposed a man who had carried deadly secrets for decades, and it had set the stage for a revelation that would ripple through the Arizona justice system, the prison yards, and the internal politics of the Mexican Mafia itself. What came next would redefine everything investigators thought they knew about Paul Eppinger. The interrogation room was small, brightly lit, and intentionally uncomfortable. Investigators had walked into it, expecting resistance, rehearsed denials, or maybe a quiet refusal to speak. They did not expect confession, certainly not confession, on a scale that would unravel some of Arizona's oldest gang-related cold cases. But when Paul Eppinger began talking, he did so with the calm, methodical tone of someone recounting memories long filed away but never forgotten. He didn't hesitate. He didn't stutter. His voice was steady, as if he were finally acknowledging events that had been waiting decades to surface. The first homicide he detailed dated back to 1991, a violent era when Arizona's street gangs and prison factions were in open conflict. The early 90s saw a surge of retaliatory killings, some ordered from inside prison, others carried out on the streets by young foot soldiers eager to earn stripes. The Mexican Mafia was consolidating power at the time, fighting to bring dozens of independent barrio gangs under its control. Disobedience, refusal to pay street taxes, or even perceived disrespect could result in a death sentence. Eppinger's description of the 1991 killing was chilling, not because of the brutality. Brutality was expected in those years, but because of the level of detail he still remembered. Specific streets, exact locations, who was present, what weapon was used, how the order was given, and most disturbingly, why the target had been selected. It wasn't random, nor was it based on emotion. It was business, pure, calculated business. The victim had been tied to a rival faction resisting Mexican Mafia influence. Eliminating him sent a message to others who dared defy the organization's expanding control. As investigators listened, they cross-referenced his statements with the case file, an aging binder containing grainy crime scene photos, outdated witness statements, and notes scribbled by detectives who had since retired or passed away. Details that had puzzled investigators 30 years earlier suddenly made sense. Motives that had remained unclear were now obvious, and inconsistencies that had hindered the case were resolved by Eppinger's precise recollections. It was as if the pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle had finally been arranged in the correct order. But the 1991 murder was only the beginning. Over the course of multiple interviews, Eppinger confessed to 4 additional homicides from the 1990s, each tied directly to gang politics, internal discipline, or strategic elimination. These were not crimes of impulse. They were orchestrated operations, planned by leaders and executed by soldiers loyal to the Mexican Mafia's code. One killing involved a suspected informant. Another targeted a rival gang member whose actions disrupted drug distribution channels. A third involved internal discipline, a member accused of violating rules that carried only one penalty: death. What shocked investigators most was not simply that Eppinger confessed, but the clarity with which he described the mechanics of each murder. He spoke about surveillance, about choosing locations that offered both concealment and escape routes, about coordinating with members on the outside, and about the strict need for control during the execution of gang orders. The precision was unsettling. It was the voice of someone who had either orchestrated or directly participated in deadly acts with unwavering resolve. Detectives who had worked gang cases for decades recognized the significance immediately. These weren't just confessions. They were authoritative accounts from a leader who had been at the center of Arizona's most violent period of Mexican Mafia expansion. They shed light on how the organization operated behind the scenes, revealing the internal politics, the chain of command, and the deadly consequences of disobedience. They confirmed patterns investigators had long suspected, that many of the unsolved murders of the 90s were not random, but calculated acts tied to a structured criminal enterprise. For some families, the news brought bittersweet relief. Parents, siblings, and children who had spent decades without answers suddenly received long-awaited closure. Detectives reached out to them with information that had seemed impossible only months earlier. But closure was complicated. Knowing who was responsible did not heal the wound. And hearing that the killer had been serving a life sentence long before confessing offered little comfort. Many of the victims had been young, some barely adults. Their lives had been cut short, not because of personal disputes, but because they became pieces on a board controlled by men inside prison walls. For law enforcement, Eppinger's confessions raised equally troubling questions. Why now? Why after decades of silence? What had changed? Some believed he feared dying with secrets. Others thought he wanted to maintain relevance by reminding investigators and the Mexican Mafia itself of his long legacy of violence and power. A few theorized that internal gang politics might have played a role. Confessing to old murders could protect allies, shield others from suspicion, or solidify his status as a man who had done what he needed to do without hesitation. There was also the possibility that the confessions were a form of negotiation. Even someone serving a life sentence has leverage. Better housing, medical access, transfer options, safety, reduced restrictions. Power in prison is not measured in years left to serve. It's measured in privileges and proximity to danger. By revealing information of enormous value, Eppinger might have been positioning himself strategically for benefits that could improve his remaining years in custody. But regardless of the motive, the outcome was the same. 5 unsolved murders suddenly resolved. A flood of new evidence validated by his statements, and an unexpected chapter in the life of a gang leader whose influence had stretched across decades. When prosecutors began piecing together the cases, they quickly realized that the evidence, old reports, crime scene details, corroborating accounts, and now Eppinger's detailed confessions, was enough to move forward. One by one, charges were filed. Not symbolic charges meant to add paperwork to an existing life sentence, but serious homicide counts, carrying decades of additional time. In total, Eppinger received an additional 25 years for each of the 5 murders. Even though he was already serving life in federal prison, these new sentences signaled something important: that accountability can still be demanded, even decades after the crimes. Inside the prison system, word of the confessions spread quickly. For some members of the Mexican Mafia, it was seen as a powerful reminder of Eppinger's history, a demonstration of his commitment to the organization's violent code. For others, it raised suspicions. Confessions are dangerous. They reopen wounds. They reveal secrets. They risk exposing others. Some wondered if the confessions were controlled disclosures, carefully curated to protect allies while closing the door on cases that could destabilize internal structures. Outside of prison, gang experts, criminologists, and former law enforcement officers weighed in. Many agreed that the confessions provided rare insight into how the Arizona Mexican Mafia had operated during its most violent era. They highlighted how the organization used fear, discipline, and calculated force to consolidate control. They showed that gang orders issued decades ago still echoed today, and that the ripple effects of those acts were still felt in communities long after the killers were imprisoned. For investigators who had spent careers chasing the shadows of these cases, the confessions marked the end of a long, frustrating journey. The men and women who had worked those homicides in the 90s had often faced silence, intimidation, and dead ends. Confessions like this almost never happen, especially from someone as deeply embedded and highly ranked as Eppinger. It was a breakthrough no one had expected, delivered not by new DNA evidence or technological advancements, but by the man who had orchestrated the violence himself. Yet as significant as the confessions were, they also marked the beginning of something deeper. With every murder he admitted to, a clearer image emerged of who Paul Eppinger truly was, not just a quiet, calculating leader of the Arizona Mexican Mafia, but a man whose influence had shaped decades of violence, discipline, and control. His words pulled back the curtain on an era many believed would remain forever unsolved. And as investigators processed the full implications of what he revealed, one question lingered in the background. If this is what he chose to confess, what remains unspoken? What investigators didn't yet know was that the impact of these confessions would reach far beyond cold case files. They would alter the balance of power inside the prison system, reshape the legal legacy of the Arizona Mexican Mafia, and add new layers to the story of a man already serving life behind bars. When the courtroom doors closed behind Paul Eppinger, there was no suspense left in the air. He wasn't a man fighting for freedom. He wasn't negotiating for a second chance or pleading for mercy. He was a figure already sealed into the bowels of the federal prison system. A man serving a life sentence that would never expire. But even so, the weight of the moment was undeniable. Prosecutors read out the charges, 5 separate homicides, each carrying 25 years, and judges signed off on sentences that stacked like layers of concrete. For most defendants, such punishment would be crushing. For Eppinger, it seemed almost ceremonial, a formal acknowledgement of a violent legacy that had stretched across decades. The sentencing was powerful, not because it added years to a sentence he would never complete, but because it closed chapters that had haunted detectives and families since the early 1990s. For law enforcement, it marked the triumph of persistence over silence. For families of the victims, it offered answers that had once felt impossible. And for the Arizona Mexican Mafia, it signaled something far more complicated: the enduring influence of a man who, even while buried behind bars, continued shaping the organization's future. Inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons, news of Eppinger's additional sentences circulated quickly, carried through phone calls, contraband cell phones, letters, and whispered conversations in day rooms and cell blocks. While some inmates shrugged, life plus 125 years was still life. Others saw the sentencing as the final solidification of Eppinger's myth. In prison culture, especially among structured gangs, a lifetime of service, violence, and loyalty cements a member's place in organizational history. Eppinger had long been regarded as one of the Arizona Mexican Mafia's most strategic minds. Now, with 5 murders publicly attributed to him, his reputation as a man willing to act quietly, decisively, and without hesitation was sealed forever. But for investigators studying the gang, the sentencing created new questions about leadership. With Eppinger's power long established and his status essentially immortalized by the confessions, who would fill the void his aging presence left behind? Prison gangs rarely allow sudden shifts. Leadership transitions are subtle, political, and often bloody. In the years leading up to the sentencing, the Arizona Mexican Mafia had already been experiencing internal friction. Younger members were more volatile, less disciplined, and more eager to assert dominance. Older members, many of whom had lived through the violence of the 1990s and early 2000s, favored stability and strategic decision-making. Eppinger's confessions, though portrayed as personal revelations, inevitably shifted the balance of influence between these generations. Some experts theorize that his decision to confess could have been rooted in internal politics. By owning the violence of the past, he may have shielded current members from prosecution, tying loose ends that could otherwise destabilize the organization. Others believed he wanted to cement his legacy on his own terms. Even in the highest ranks of prison gangs, ego and legacy matter. Claiming responsibility for acts of violence is often seen as proof of dedication and authority, not shame. But not everyone inside the Mexican Mafia viewed the confessions positively. Some saw them as reckless, exposing old operations, confirming long-whispered secrets, and potentially drawing law enforcement attention to figures still active today. Gang organizations thrive on silence, and confessions, no matter how carefully curated, violate an unspoken rule. You take your secrets to the grave. Whether the confessions would create lasting friction within the organization was a question only time could answer. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, prosecutors took a different view. To them, the additional sentences represented a rare victory in the battle against organized gang violence. Cold cases are notoriously difficult to solve, especially those tied to prison gangs where witness intimidation, lack of evidence, and decades of silence can eclipse even the most determined investigative efforts. Eppinger's confessions allowed detectives to tie up cases that had been passed from one generation of investigators to the next, kept alive only by the hope that someday something, anything, would break the silence.